Hello, welcome to Gladiodrome, the official podcast of the Deep State. Opinions expressed herein are not our own. Now, unfortunately, Rusty could not make it today. He is on day 2 of a 5-day Datura retreat, and he was supposed to be teleconferencing in, but I believe they took his phone from him because he kept trying to look up Rule 34 of the Hat Man. Not really sure what's going on there. He will be back next week. This is the first episode back since Thanksgiving. I hope all of you had a great Thanksgiving, a properly consumptive Black Friday. There's not an enormous amount on the docket today, so I think we'll just kind of jump into things. First on the list, a new poll places Jeffrey Epstein at a 10% approval rating amongst the U.S. public. Now, I'm not really sure why they're running a poll on that. I don't think he's going to be running for re-election or anything of that matter. Maybe it's to determine whether or not the heat is off of him enough to where he can come out of hiding. Now, while a 10% approval rating may seem awfully high, when you compare it to something like the congressional approval rating, which is 14%, suddenly it makes more sense. Most people have their heads screwed on straight. I think that also any poll that's conducted, there's going to be 1 in 10 people who just answer completely radically incorrectly, like me. Anyways, we wish him the best of luck with his endeavors, wherever he may be. On to the next subject, and kind of the main thing that I wanted to talk about today, or really the only other thing that I wanted to talk about today. I am, of course, referring to the current political difficulties of former vice presidential candidate and, quote, serious retard, Tim Walz. And let's kind of start tackling where to begin with all of this. Now, to first set the stage, something to bear in mind is that there was a news story that came out maybe 2 weeks ago or so, and this is something that has been somewhat known in the more politically fringe corners of the internet, or Minnesotan corners of the internet. By the way, I'm trying to get Will Stancil on the show. Hopefully he will. What I'm talking about is the report that the state of Minnesota wound up more or less directly funneling $1 billion with a B dollars to the terrorist group al-shabaab. And the way that they did this, now this wasn't the state's idea, that this was just something that was facilitated by the state, perhaps intentionally, as we will come to learn. Now, the way this happened kind of caught people's attention because of the, let's say, creativity of it. So this was something that was being done by the Somali American community in Minnesota, or specifically Minneapolis. And the way it kind of got caught was that behavioral scientists were trying to look into this cluster of like, hey, why do all Somalis apparently have autism in Minnesota? And it turns out what was happening was that an enormous number of Somali children and teenagers were being diagnosed by community psychologists as having a case of the Lego brain, the autism. And the reason for this, as it turned out, was that the state of Minnesota has funds that can be dispersed to the parents and teachers of students with autism, basically to cover learning accommodations, whatever. But it's done via just disbursement of a check. So really what it has is that the state of Minnesota has autism bucks. You know, if you have autism, you get the autism bucks. Well, what was happening was that damn near every Somalian was getting their kid diagnosed as autistic, and then either under duress or of their own volition, sending all of the autism bucks back to Somalia to basically be collected by a radical Islamic terrorist group, al-shabaab. And people, I've had a number of run-ins recently with the Somali community online. And one of the points of contention really was that the claim that, it was being done under duress. and it may have just been those people's desire to send that money back, but it kind of gets ahead of the main issue that I have with this, which is, not that these people are Somalian, not even that they're committing, insurance fraud, not that they look like, they created the white devil, but no, it's the fact that if they're not doing this under duress, not with, being extorted, with, family members at risk or whatever, then that I believe that's just treason. Like, this is a terrorist organization that they are stealing money from the U.S. government and giving it to. So, not a great look. And the way that the funding of the program kind of worked was that, for a decent number of years, the expenditure was around $3 million. Then within 1 year, it went from $3 million to $51 million. Then something like, $51 million to $126 million the next year, then $126 million to $390 million the year before that. So what is that? We're 3 years in and we're up from... So 3 years in and we're 130 times the expenditure. And over the span of, 3 or 4 years, the state of Minnesota wound up forking over literally $1 billion to terrorist group al-shabaab. So people are, I would say, understandably displeased with that, and they have some questions. Now, where things start to get difficult here is that, first, the New York Times recently published an article pretty much calling it like it is, and that you're fucked when something that's a conspiracy, the New York Times is just like, yep, yeah, no, that shit happened. That shit happened exactly like, we expected it would. They're going after a Democratic VP for something that immigrants did. So they must have him caught about as red-handed as it is possible to be. This is made pretty abundantly clear by the New York Times article's headline that reads, "How Fraud Swamped Minnesota's Social Services System on Tim Walz's Watch." And then the byline, prosecutors say members of the Somali diaspora, a group with growing political power, were largely responsible. President Trump has drawn national attention to the scandal amid his crackdown on immigration. For you to get sort of name-checked like that as a Democrat currently by the New York Times in a story about stuff Somalians did, you need to have fucked up. Now, that's kind of just setting the ambient temperature here, because what's more interesting is that this was a press release put out on Twitter, or X, the everything site, whatever you want to call it, today, by the Minnesota Department of Human Services. I will be reading this verbatim. Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on, hoping for a partnership in stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, threats, repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. Instead of partnership, we got the full weight of retaliation by Tim Walz, certain DFL members, and an indifferent mainstream media. It's scary, isolating, and left us wondering who we can turn to. Remember, this is a state agency. In addition to retaliating against whistleblowers, Tim Walz disempowered the Office of the Legislative Auditor, allowing agencies to disregard their audit findings and guidance. Media and politicians supporting Tim Walz or the DFL agenda attacked whistleblowers who were trying to raise red flags on fraudulent activities. This is a cascade of systemic failures leading up to Tim Walz. Agency leaders appointed by Tim Walz willfully disregarded rules and laws to keep fraud reports quiet, even to the extent of threatening families of whistleblowers. These same leaders are not qualified for their jobs, instead getting leadership jobs via Tim Walz's friendship, so state government were left floundering. DFL lawmakers refused to acknowledge fraud and deflected any serious conversation to stop fraud. Biased mainstream media, such as WCCO and NPR, showed absolutely no interest in covering fraud happening in our own state. Programs, especially in behavioral health and disability services, were built without any guardrails against fraud, all in an attempt to extract more funding from legislature and the federal government. As staff, we firsthand witnessed and observed fraud happening, yet we were shut down, reassigned, and told to keep quiet. Sometimes more. Leadership did not want to appear to discriminate against certain communities and were unwilling to take action, such as stopping fraud, that would have an adverse impact on their image. To date, no single agency leader has been held responsible for their role in fraud, whether it's Shireen Gandhi, Jess Geil, Jody Harpstead, Natasha Mers, Eric Groomdahl, or others. It is a structure created and maintained by Tim Walz, who has created an environment of interrelated agencies and institutions, including the media, that help foster fraud through retaliation and turning a blind eye in exchange for political gain in the form of high-power agency leadership jobs or other perks. Fundamentally, Tim Walz is dishonest, lacks ethics and integrity, has poor leadership abilities, and has never taken any accountability for his role in fraud. Now, I would like to say that I like how he gave his son the simple Jack haircut before the DNC, but that's just a side note. Back to the statement. Instead, Tim Walz deflects by blaming national politics for his own failings and distracts the public with inveterate lying. These lies include his reference of a budget surplus under his tenure. Fact is, Minnesota never had a surplus. We had been given federal ARPA funds, like at Advanced Research Projects Agency, like the ARPA in DARPA. We had been given federal ARPA funds that were conflated as surplus money, otherwise we'd be in a deficit. And those ARPA funds, which were meant to be temporary funds, were used to create more leadership positions for Tim Walz's buddies. Do any of you have any idea, like, how much of a fuck-up that is? Let me just finish this out. As such, we can't fight fraud in Minnesota alone, hence why we're appealing to the federal levels of government. We need all the help we can get, as Tim Walz's agency leaders have upped their brazen approach in covering up their knowledge of fraud. And then it's just like, thank yous and shout-outs to the New York Times and stuff. But, like, oh my God. So, that's going to look really bad that, you're giving ARPA funds to your lackeys and al-shabaab. And I think that's not really what that was meant to be used for. So that's what I believe they call giving it to you with the bark still on. That is awful. Now, what do we know about Tim Walz? Other than that, he's friends with school shooters, his words, and quit the National Guard when it became clear he was actually going to get deployed for the first time, and just leaned into his son being intellectually disabled. No, his son has ADHD and anxiety, and a very unfortunate haircut, but... Like, okay, so am I just a terrible person here, or were they really, trying to play the sympathy card on that? Yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. Well, the reason that most of us know about Tim Walz is obviously because he was the vice presidential pick of erstwhile candidate Kamala Harris. And he was, as far as I can tell, the second choice pick because... The first pick, Josh Shapiro, good old Israel head stab 20 times suicide. I'm not even going to get into that. We all know he was in the IDF, and some would say facilitated covering up that guy he knew's girlfriend allegedly... I don't want to get sued. We all know that bit of it. But the real reason, other than, that whole debacle with Josh, was that the Harris campaign realized that they were... I think someone at least had the idea that, hey, if we tailor our campaign exclusively to... millennial women, that's not going to win anyone else, and they would already vote for us. So what they decided to do was okay, what we need someone to play this weird, pantomime, pastiche, hick rube white guy. and they picked Tim Walz. And one thing that I think is either, like, this will either be something that is, just inherently obvious to you from the first time you looked at Tim Walz and heard him speak, or something that I think will be kind of a devastating realization about he just has fun dad energy. Like, the entire voter bloc of people to whom Tim Walz was supposed to appeal from the jump looked at him and saw nothing but, like, this weird, malevolent pussy who's trying to, like, be like, I'm so stupid and folksy, just like you fucking idiots. And, like, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I would say the entire coalition of people that, Tim Walz was supposed to appeal to, namely white guys, and not the kind that the Democrats don't like. It's just very clear that, it was I think that they were just worse at sensing inauthenticity, but just the way that everything about him, I think set a lot of people's hackles up immediately. But looking into him, he is truly maybe the most reprehensible person that was running in that election. And I'm including a pedophile and potential Russian asset. And it's like, how do you top that? Well, I'm not going to make any allegations about Tim Walz on one regard, but I will say that Tim Walz was evidently more of a Chinese asset than Trump was a Russian asset, as now, this might sound hard to believe, but apparently the Department of Homeland Security already had an ongoing investigation into Tim Walz being a Chinese asset before he was tapped as vice president. Like, this wasn't, anything politically motivated. This was them going like, yeah, we think this guy is enough of a Chinese spy that we're really investigating him just due to us not trusting him to be the governor of Minnesota. This predated him getting tapped as VP. And now, why might people think that Mr. Seriously Retarded Tim Walz is a Chinese asset? Well, let's take a look at that. So, number one was the fact that the first place that he flew, other than basic training, was China, and he visited China 30 more times. I feel like I would be suspicious of someone trying to, I would be suspicious of any American who's not Chinese and doesn't have Chinese family, or doesn't work in China doing, I don't know, electronic shit, like Shenzhen, organ buying, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Like, someone who recreationally visits China 30 times as an American citizen really, I'm going to be honest here, ought to be probably arrested. That's a lot of times to go to China. But don't worry, a lot of these trips to China, he was bringing children with him, who he was giving copies of the Little Red Book to. Okay, that's cool. Now, something that's a bit more interesting and quite illuminating from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Let me pull up my phone here. So, this is from an article about how Tim and Gwen Walz met and got married. So this is a quote. Back home and working full-time for the Nebraska National Guard, Walz was also teaching and coaching about an hour away from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There he met Gwen Whipple, a fellow teacher and a Minnesota native. On their first date to the only movie theater in town, then Hardee's, she refused a kiss. He said they'd be married someday. Their honeymoon was a trip to China with 60 kids in tow. Now, let's pop over to the Washington Post real quick for a quote from Gwen Walz talking about her husband's choice of wedding date. She's quoted as saying, "He wanted to have a date he'll always remember." Now, what day did they get married? Their wedding anniversary is June 4th. Now, what happened on June 4th? Let's see. Massachusetts becomes the first state of the United States to set a minimum wage. The first Pulitzer Prize is awarded. Congress approves the 19th Amendment. Tonga gains independence from the British Empire. The VHS videotape is revealed. Jonathan Pollard pleads guilty to espionage for selling top-secret U.S. military intelligence to Israel. Oh, 1989. The Chinaman Square protests are suppressed in Beijing by the People's Liberation Army, with between 241 and 10,000 dead, in unofficial estimate. It's like 550. But yes, he intentionally got married on the anniversary of Chinaman Square. And yes, that is how you pronounce it. Back to the Star Tribune. Their honeymoon was a trip to China with 60 kids in tow, they noted in 2018. Then in 2019, in a profile of the state's new First Lady, they reported, they spent their honeymoon in China on a trip they organized for dozens of students. There was an odd number of students, so the couple didn't even sleep in the same room. Okay, I'm going to be honest. If you are on your honeymoon and you choose to not sleep with your new wife in the same room and instead sleep in a room with high school students, I think you're probably a pedophile and you're having sex with the children in China. And, you know, this is an opinion. I'm not saying he did that. I'm saying that it is my opinion that Governor of Minnesota most likely had sex with children in China. This is an opinion. This is an allegation I am making. I'm not stating that he did this. This is not slander. Is it slander or libel when it's spoken? Basically, like, that's weird as fuck. That is so fucking weird. He did that. I'm not even going to bring up what allegedly may or may not have occurred at an Indigo Girls concert in 1999, because of the fact that I went back to go pull the old statement, and all of the accounts that were talking about that have been nuked, so I guess that they're pulling out the big guns for that one, so just make sure you don't dig into Tim Walz Indigo Girls concert 1999 allegations. But yeah, there's that. Also, yeah, then the whole Department of Homeland Security thing where they thought that he was a compromised Chinese asset before he was even the vice presidential pick. Like, they thought he was too much of a compromised Chinese asset to even be governor of Minnesota. Which, to be fair, I think they made the right call on that, considering he more or less facilitated giving $1 billion to al-shabaab. What else? Last thing. Remember how there was that weird assassination of those two Minnesota state reps? And that was all big news because like, oh yeah, these Republicans are killing Democrats. And then they found the shooter who was like, he had some kind of weird, like, glowy-ass background where he was, like, training militias in Congo or some shit like that. I'm probably directionally correct, but wrong on the details there. It was something shady as shit, though. And what he claimed was that he had been hired by Tim Walz to assassinate two people who had been voting against him on bills he wanted to pass. And then that just dropped out of the media completely. So, yes, seriously retarded Tim Walz. We saw how you held that shotgun. What else is being brought up? I guess the only other thing is on the topic of Somalians in Minnesota. Congressman Ilhan Omar is also kind of in the hot seat right now. And there's a lot of discourse going on around that. Trump called her hijab swaddled, and I think that one was unnecessary. I think that, there's no reason to criticize Ilhan Omar for wearing a hijab when there's many other things to criticize her for, including stating that she is Somalia first, lying a lot, marrying her brother. And with the details on that, like, the way that that's being framed is, a conspiracy theory is one of the fake ones when people will, like, dig into the actual evidence or claims to make fun of the evidence and claims, when they just try to, stick to the broad strokes of it and then creatively reframe the broad strokes of it. Like, oh, so what, you think she's having sex with her brother? And it's like, no. That's not why. Like, I actually got someone on Twitter mad at me and was going like, man, I can't believe, you'd be so stupid to believe this, because So just for kind of a posterity's sake, I'm going to break down what a lot of the hubbub about Ilhan Omar allegedly marrying her brother is about. So there was a period of time between, I believe, 2011 and 2013, or it was either 2009 to 2011 or 2011 to 2013. A 2-year on-the-dot period where she divorced her previous husband and then married a guy who looks exactly like her, who was not an American citizen. And so people will claim that she's doing this to get American citizenship. She was already an American citizen. This guy was not. This guy, I believe, was only a British citizen. So she married him for exactly 2 years on the dot, the guy that looks exactly like her, in order for him to get a green card, and then finds a no-fault faith-based divorce that lets him keep his green card, and then immediately gets back together with her old husband. And also, just if you look at any of the interviews in Somali community papers in Minnesota from the time period, they're all like, this is her brother. Like, the Somalians say that this is her brother, and he looks exactly like her, and she was married to him for 2 years, just long enough for him to get a green card. And then she went back to her old husband afterwards. So that's why people say that she married her brother, because she kind of did. Anyways, we wish her the best of luck on her future endeavors. This is the end of this episode of Gladiodrome.